The house was still. Autumn had enveloped everything, adding an unusual heaviness to the walls surrounding me. My thoughts wandered, caught between the demands of school and the enticing prospect of having the place to myself for the weekend. My dad had been away on a business trip for weeks, and my mom, who had just returned from visiting her sister, mentioned she'd soon be heading out again to catch up with an old friend. I could see the weariness in her eyes as she detailed her plans. She appeared exhausted, as if she were trying to escape something, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what that might be. I nodded absent-mindedly, thrilled at the idea of a vacant house. When the door clicked shut behind her, I made a beeline for my room, feeling that strange, liberating solitude wrap around me. I tossed my backpack onto the floor, drew the blinds, and savored a rare sense of tranquility. Time slipped away unnoticed as I let myself unwind, diving into my own world for the first time in what felt like forever. Suddenly, the echo of a car door slamming jolted me, pulling me from my reverie. I froze. My mom shouldn't have been back yet. She had just left, and the sound of her keys jingling against the door felt like a thunderclap, more intense than it had any right to be. The door swung open, and I heard her familiar, soothing voice call out, "Hello!" Her tone resonated through the hall, maintaining its usual softness. However, something about it was different, something that made my stomach twist. Panic surged through me, too quick to rein in. I rushed to hide the overwhelming evidence of my solitude, but it was too late. The doorknob turned, and in an instant, she stood there in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, and in that moment, everything inside me turned cold. "Sorry," I began, but my voice felt small and empty. The confusion in her gaze cut deep. She looked at me, truly looked, as if trying to understand something that eluded her grasp. A tense silence enveloped the room as she took a breath, blinking as though attempting to process what she had just walked in on. I wanted to say something, to clarify the situation, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt parched, and I stood there waiting for her to say anything that might break the chilling silence between us. Her expression softened slightly, but not quite. There was no anger in her gaze, just something much more intricate. After what felt like an eternity, she let out a quiet, almost inaudible sigh. Her face shifted into an expression I couldn't decipher. She blinked a few times and then, without another word, turned and exited the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear her footsteps fading down the hallway. I exhaled deeply, my mind swirling with a peculiar mix of embarrassment, confusion, and an undefined emotion. The tension hung in the air like a dense fog. Each step I took felt heavy, and I found myself avoiding her presence. Not from fear, but sheer discomfort. My mind replayed the moment she had entered my room. Her astonished face, the silence that followed. Couldn't shake it. As much as I wanted to move on, the memory clung to me, casting a shadow over every thought. One late evening, just as I was trying to lose myself in a textbook, a gentle knock on my door interrupted my concentration. For a moment, I froze, unsure if I wanted to face her. Then her voice came, soft yet somewhat hesitant. "Are you busy?" she asked quietly. I inhaled deeply, closed my book, and braced myself. "No, I'm just reading," I replied, attempting to keep my tone casual. She opened the door, peeking in with a faint smile. "I was just thinking, do you remember those nights we used to spend watching movies together? Those all-night marathons?" Her voice carried a sense of nostalgia, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the mother I had known during my childhood. Lively and warm, always striving to bring everyone together. "Yeah, of course I remember," I replied, warmth creeping into my tone despite myself. "Would you want to do that again?" she asked, sounding almost shy. "We could pick one of those old classics you used to love." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to decline to avoid the awkwardness still lingering between us. But another part of me, the part that missed our connection, urged me to agree. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure. Why not?" A few minutes later, we were both settled in the living room. A stack of DVDs on the coffee table, soft lamplight casting a cozy glow over the space. She was curled up on the couch, looking surprisingly relaxed, as if all the earlier tension had vanished. I found myself easing up too, letting my guard down a bit. We chose a movie we both knew by heart, the kind you can quote along with. As the film began, she chuckled at a familiar line, and I found myself laughing as well. Slowly, the tension started to dissipate, replaced by an unexpected sense of ease. It felt good, almost natural, and I realized how much I had missed these moments. The companionship, the comfort of simply being together. About halfway through the movie, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before darting away. A warmth radiated through me, bringing a reassuring and calming sensation. "Me too," I replied, almost whispering, feeling that strange connection drawing us closer. I wasn't entirely sure what was happening, but in that moment, everything felt perfectly aligned. It wasn't until later, as the credits began to roll, that I realized she hadn't released my hand. She turned to me, her expression soft, almost vulnerable. The silence between us crackled with unspoken words. Then, almost instinctively, she leaned in and brushed her lips gently against my cheek. I froze, taken aback. It was a fleeting moment, nearly innocent. Yet there was a tenderness in that simple gesture that resonated deeper than anything I'd experienced before. She quickly turned away, and for a heartbeat, we sat in silence, both too stunned to articulate our thoughts. Clearing her throat, she shifted slightly, as if she were regaining her composure. "Good night," she whispered, so softly I could barely catch it. Rising, she turned toward the hallway, leaving me behind, my mind racing as I replayed that moment over and over while sitting in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the soft hum of the DVD player. An odd mix of emotions surged within me. The following days were infused with a peculiar, unspoken understanding between us. We never mentioned that night in the living room. The movie, the laughter, or the gentle brush of her lips against my cheek, but I felt the weight of it. Every glance exchanged, every fleeting moment we shared in the same space, carried a heaviness. I longed to say something, to address the situation and clear the air, but the words eluded me, lodged somewhere in my throat, leaving us both in a silent limbo. One afternoon, she knocked softly on my door again. This time, there was a different aura about her. A sense of calm, as if she had reached some internal resolution. "I was thinking," she said as she stepped inside, "why don't we get out of the house? Maybe take a little road trip, just the two of us." I was a bit taken aback. "Really?" I asked. "Yeah," she replied, a small smile gracing her lips, as if she'd expected my reaction. "I thought it might be good for us. We could find a peaceful spot, maybe sit by the lake and clear our minds." Something about her suggestion struck a chord with me, as if we both shared an unspoken agreement that a change of scenery was just what we needed. "Sure," I said, nodding. "That sounds nice." The drive turned out to be longer than I anticipated, but the silence between us felt surprisingly comfortable. She had a playlist of soft tunes that filled the car with a sense of nostalgia. I watched the trees whiz by outside the window, allowing the gentle hum of the engine to soothe my thoughts. It felt as if we were both searching for something on this journey, a way to move forward, or perhaps just an escape from the complexities that had settled over us. When we finally arrived at the lake, the view took my breath away. The water lay still and serene, perfectly mirroring the sky above. It felt untouched, as though we were stepping into a world that belonged solely to us. We found a spot by the shore, laying out a blanket and settling in with the calm lake stretching out before us. She sighed, leaning back and closing her eyes as the breeze played with her hair. "I missed this," she murmured, almost to herself. "I missed just being." I watched her for a moment, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite identify. "Yeah," I replied softly, gazing out over the water. "Sometimes it feels like everything is moving so fast, and we're just stuck." She opened her eyes, glancing at me with an expression that was both familiar and new. "It's hard to find moments like this anymore," she said, her voice a gentle murmur. Life just takes over, doesn't it? I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deeply within me. We sat in silence for a while, simply observing the lake and allowing the stillness to fill the space between us. It felt like a release, a chance to breathe in harmony with the world around us. Then, out of nowhere, she reached over and placed her hand on mine, her fingers warm and reassuring. I looked down at our hands, a jolt of warmth coursing up my arm. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried a weight that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. "This is nice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I could sense her gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. I knew that if I did, I would see something I wasn't ready to confront. The silence lingered, heavy yet somehow comforting. Then, without a word, she rested her head on my shoulder, letting out a soft sigh. It was a small act, one we'd shared countless times before, but this time it felt different. There was a quiet intimacy in the gesture, something that transcended words. After what felt like an eternity, she lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were soft, searching, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "I'm glad we did this," she said quietly, her voice infused with a tenderness that was almost painful in its honesty. "Me too," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. Neither of us moved. We were locked in each other's gaze, and I felt an unusual pull, an invisible thread connecting us. Then, without thinking, I leaned in, brushing my lips against hers in a soft, tentative kiss. The kiss was quick, barely a whisper against my lips, but its effect left me breathless. Her eyes widened, yet she didn't pull away. Instead, she lingered close, her gaze infused with a quiet understanding. We remained silent, not daring to acknowledge what had just happened. She settled her head back on my shoulder, and we continued to watch the lake as the sun sank lower in the sky. As days passed, the tension between us thickened. We never spoke of that afternoon by the lake, but I could feel its presence hanging in the air, weighing down on us with every glance and unintentional brush of our hands. It was an unspoken bond that neither of us knew how to address. A part of me longed to confront it, to bring the matter into the open, yet a larger part of me was terrified of where that conversation might lead. One late night, after I had retreated to my room, struggling to focus on my studies, a soft knock echoed through the silence. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, gentle yet persistent. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice a whisper from the other side of the door. I hesitated, my heartbeat quickening as I stared at my blurred textbook. "Yeah, I'm awake. You can come in," I replied, shutting my book and sitting up as she entered the room. Dressed in a cozy, oversized sweater with her hair slightly tousled, she looked as if she hadn't slept at all. The expression on her face was hard to decipher, a mix of uncertainty and something deeper, a reflection of the turmoil swirling within me. "I know it's late," she said softly, avoiding my gaze as if she were second-guessing her choice. "But could you join me in the living room? I've been feeling a bit restless." I nodded, sensing the same pull I had felt by the lake. "Of course. Let's go," I replied, attempting to keep my voice steady. We walked quietly down the hall, an undercurrent of significance threading through this midnight rendezvous. The house was dark and still, shadows dancing across the walls as we made our way to the living room. She had set up a cozy nook on the couch, complete with blankets and a bottle of wine perched on the coffee table, its deep red color glistening under the soft light of a solitary lamp. With deliberate movements, she poured us each a glass, her actions almost ritualistic. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping slowly and allowing the wine's warmth to envelop us. "I couldn't sleep," she finally broke the quiet, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I've been thinking about everything." I nodded, my heart racing. "Yeah, same here," I said, surprised by my own candidness. "It feels like so much has changed, even though we're both pretending it hasn't." She stared at her glass, tracing its rim with her fingers. "I know," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. and I don't know what to do about it." There was a rawness in her tone that made my chest ache. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that would ease the tension, but I felt at a loss. Instead, I observed her take a shaky breath, glancing at me with a look of quiet desperation. "It's like I'm losing you," she continued, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, "and I don't know how to hold on. Everything feels different, and I'm not sure if it's meant to." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had never heard her express herself so openly, so vulnerably. Setting my glass down, I instinctively reached out to cover hers with my hand. "You're not losing me?" I reassured her softly, feeling the weight of my words. "I'm still here. We're both still here." She met my gaze, her eyes reflecting a fragile hope mingled with fear. For a heartbeat, we simply held each other's eyes, the unspoken tension between us tightening like a drawn bowstring. I wasn't sure who initiated it, but suddenly, we were close, our faces only inches apart. Her breath warmed my skin, and I could see uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But then she closed them, leaning in, her lips brushing against mine in a tentative, almost questioning kiss. This kiss felt different. It was gentle and hesitant, as if she were testing the waters, unsure of how far to venture. Yet there was an undeniable warmth in it, a tenderness that felt both comforting and new, wrapped in complexity. When we pulled apart, the silence that enveloped us was heavy with unspoken words. She looked at me, her eyes wide as if searching for answers in my expression. But I had none to provide. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know why I did that." I shook my head, struggling to gather my thoughts. "You don't need to apologize," I said, barely managing to keep my voice steady. I didn't want you to stop." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "This is all so confusing," she confessed, her voice just above a whisper. "I don't know what's right anymore." We sat there, the weight of our confusion pressing down on us, binding us in a way that felt both comforting and painful. She leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. We remained in that position for what felt like hours, allowing the silence to speak for us, letting the warmth between us offer solace that words couldn't convey. As the night wore on, the events of the evening settled heavily in my mind, bringing an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. Eventually, she drifted into a peaceful sleep beside me, her breathing gentle and rhythmic, her hands still intertwined with mine. I stayed awake, captivated by the rise and fall of her chest, while my mind spun with questions I couldn't seem to grasp. What were we doing? What did this mean for our relationship? I was aware that I couldn't ignore the feelings that had emerged, the emotions I had long buried, but the fear of crossing an irretrievable line kept me frozen. As dawn's light crept through the curtains, I quietly slipped out from under her, draping a blanket over her before making my way back to my room. I needed time to think, to process everything that had unfolded. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that things between us could never go back to how they were. That night had irrevocably altered the course of our relationship, leaving a mark that couldn't be erased. As much as I longed to hold on to the closeness we had discovered, I understood we were teetering on the brink of something perilous, something that could either draw us closer or tear us apart. The following days felt surreal, as if we were cohabiting the same house but existing in entirely different realities. I couldn't look at her without replaying that midnight conversation in my mind, remembering how her head had rested on my shoulder and the warmth of her fingers woven with mine. A nagging ache settled between us, thick and unavoidable, yet we never dared to speak of it. Every time I tried to broach the subject, to acknowledge what had transpired, the words slipped away, leaving me trapped in a cocoon of silence. One evening, just as I was preparing to study, she appeared in my doorway. Her expression was hard to read, but the tension around her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, crossing an invisible boundary. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice taut. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine." I shut my book, my heart racing. I had been anticipating this moment, but now that it was here, dread settled in my stomach. I know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to handle this either. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to sit beside me on the bed. The silence stretched between us, thick and unresolved. She fidgeted with her fingers, an unfamiliar gesture that made it clear how deeply affected she was by everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I think we need to establish some boundaries, she said. Things have gotten too blurry lately, and I'm not sure that's safe for us. The word safe pierced through the fog of emotions clouding my mind. I nodded slowly, feeling incapable of forming words. I wanted to ask why it had come to this, why we had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. But the questions felt too raw, too exposed. Maybe we should take a step back, she continued, glancing at me with uncertainty in her eyes, to remind ourselves of who we are to each other. My heart sank at her suggestion. I knew she was right, yet the thought of retreating, of returning to the emotional distance we once shared, felt like a painful loss. I wasn't ready to confront that reality. She reached out, her hand resting on mine. The touch was warm and familiar, yet it carried a fragility that felt like an impending farewell. I'm still your mother, she whispered, as if reassuring both herself and me. And I love you as my son. We have to hold on to that. I met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. I know, I said, my voice barely audible. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to make these feelings go away. Her eyes shimmered with a blend of sorrow and something that resembled regret. It's complicated, she admitted, her tone raw and sincere. I'm not sure how we ended up here, but whatever this is, it can't continue. We need to find a way back. For what felt like an eternity, we sat there, enveloped by silence filled with unsaid thoughts. There was a yearning, a longing that neither of us could articulate, hanging in the air like a tangible weight. Then, almost instinctively, she leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss on my forehead. It was a mother's kiss, tender and filled with unspoken affection, but it carried a different significance this time, a sense of closure. I just want you to know, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, that you mean the world to me. I never intended for things to get so complicated. I swallowed hard, a tightness forming in my throat. I know, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. You mean everything to me, too. We fell into silence again, each lost in our thoughts, the weight of her words pressing heavily upon us. Yet there was an understanding, a silent agreement that this was where we drew the line and where we would attempt to rebuild what had been lost. As she rose to leave, she offered me a sad, lingering smile. Good night, she whispered, turning to the door. Just as she reached the threshold, she paused, her back still to me. Sometimes I wonder, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, if things could have been different, if maybe in another life we could have been something else. My heart stopped, the gravity of her words pulling me under. She didn't turn to look at me, and I remained still, afraid that if I moved, everything would shatter. I yearned to reach out, to say something, anything, to disrupt the weight of that moment, but I couldn't find the words. Without another sound, she slipped away, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving me enveloped in quiet. I sat there, her words echoing in my mind, filling me with an aching emptiness. Could things have been different? Could we have been something else? I didn't know, and the question lingered in the air, haunting me as the silence of the empty room enveloped me.